If the crossbow was at a disadvantage in open battle, it was supremely suited to the castle-based hostilities so central to medieval warfare." End quote. With this statement, Hardy and Strickland, two of the leading experts on the subject, summarize an opinion held by many historians and history buffs, that the longbow is a battle weapon, while the crossbow is a siege weapon. But is this really the case? Some recent experiments raise questions about this claim, and if we look closely at the available literature, it becomes clear that there is actually very little research on how archers and crossbowmen were historically employed in sieges. In particular, there are many unanswered questions about the practical and tactical use of the crossbows. In a nutshell, the classic argument goes like this. Because the longbow is larger and bulkier, archers were less mobile in the confined spaces of a wall or a fortress, and could not shoot as well through embrasures and battlements. Crossbowmen did not have these problems, because their weapons were much more compact. Also, a crossbow could be prepared, held loaded, and shot immediately when an opportunity presents itself. Therefore, it is better suited for slow, precise shooting. In addition, the cover provided by a fortress neutralized the crossbow's biggest drawback, its long reload time. The only disadvantage of a crossbow in sieges was that the bolt could drop off the weapon when it was shot downwards. Did you see what fellow YouTuber Todd did there? He simply held down the bolt with his thumb. This is probably something that people from the Middle Ages had already thought of, so we can cross point 4 off the list. In the test you've been shown, Todd and archer Joe Gibbs shot from an 18 meters high Pope's Tower in Stanton Harcourt. In doing this, they made some observations that cast doubt on the classic arguments. Todd says the crossbow is somewhat more practical to use, but
it's not the game-changing advantage that I thought crossbows might have in this situation.
So we should definitely take a closer look at the issue. Now, before we discuss the classic arguments in detail, we would like to note 3 things. Firstly, we have already made a video on the traditional longbow versus crossbow arguments, such as rate of fire, penetrating power, and training effort. So we will only consider these if they are directly relevant here. Secondly, the question of which weapon was better is a thought experiment, a fascinating one that can provide insight into how longbows and crossbows were used in sieges, but a thought experiment nonetheless. Obviously, both weapons were useful. They were both used in sieges and even often used at the same time. For example, siege towers were frequently manned with mixed squads of archers and crossbowmen. The kings of England and France regarded crossbowmen as a mainstay of castle defense from 1154, or possibly even earlier, and well into the 13th century. And even in Wales, the home of the longbow, crossbowmen were often used in sieges. For contemporaries, there was no such thing as a siege weapon or a battle weapon. Thirdly, we are not experts on crossbows and archery. We simply present our thoughts and ideas in this video based on our historical background knowledge. Unlike the rest of the longbow versus crossbow debate, this video isn't about matters of life and death. So don't take it too seriously, and just put your suggestions and arguments in the comments. The most significant difference between a field battle and a siege was that the archers almost always had cover during a siege. The defenders had walls, battlements, and arrow loops, and the attackers rarely ventured within range of the castle without a mobile protection. For example, when Richard the Lionheart besieged Nottingham Castle in 1194, he, quote, had his men take strong, thick, broad shields. Many a man carried these in front of him until he came up to the gateway. They protected themselves extremely well, so that the crossbowmen did not hurt them. End quote. This provided cover for archers and crossbowmen, but it also restricted their freedom of movement. At first glance, it seems intuitively clear that the crossbow was more practical during sieges due to its compact design, which helped when moving through narrow corridors or over slender walls, and shooting through loopholes or battlements. Todd's test shows that intuition is a poor guide in this case. He and Joe found that they were both quite uncomfortable shooting downwards, even though there is plenty of space on Pope's Tower, and the battlements are widely set apart. Overall, the longbow was a little unwieldier, but both had similar problems. At the end of the test, there was little left of the crossbow's presumed superiority.
So I think that's probably where the advantage comes. I can keep up awkward shooting. Actually, that is probably where it is. I can keep up awkward shooting better than you can keep up awkward shooting. Maybe it's just as simple as that, really.
The question is, of course, to what extent this can be generalized. The situation would certainly have been very different in a castle with loopholes. Nevertheless, the fundamental challenges, such as limited space and poor footing, were probably always similar. Still, perhaps the living history people who have already tried something like this can say more about it. It's also interesting to note that both the longbow and the crossbow reach their limits when the enemy is very close. In Todd's test, neither the archer nor the crossbowman could hit a target closer than 15 meters to the tower without leaning over the battlements, which is probably not what you want to do if the enemy is shooting back. So, if a castle had no protruding towers along its walls to shoot from, the defenders had to resort to projectiles that could be thrown more steeply downward, like javelins, stones, or pieces of wood. However, Hardy and Strickland showed that loopholes are often designed for specific weapons. For example, the kings of England, who, as said earlier, relied on the crossbow as their primary defensive weapon in the 13th century, built and extended their castles so they could best be defended with the crossbow. This certainly gave an advantage to the weapon the defenses were made for, but purely by its design alone, the crossbow probably had less of an advantage over the longbow in castle defense than one might think. At the beginning, I mentioned that this video is a thought experiment, right? Well, here's another one for you. How would you rebuild civilization if it were to collapse? Given the current geopolitical climate is not entirely out of question, is it? If that were to happen, you need to know how to purify water, build a wolf pen to protect your livestock from wild animals, and maybe even figure out how to create penicillin, gunpowder, and soap. Luckily, today's sponsor has you covered with the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization. This isn't just any book, it's a beautifully illustrated guide with hand-drawn sketches on every page, and packed with practical knowledge you might need if, for any reason, society faces a bit of a continuity problem. Inside, you'll find everything from how to make fire and find clean water, to creating electricity and navigating while sailing. It even covers how to make toothpaste or paper. But that's not all. Whether you're learning to make glue, duct tape, or tie a knot, and knowing when to use it, this book has it all. It's a perfect blend of survival skills, history, and science, all explained in simple, accessible language. Plus, the stunning illustrations make it as much a work of art as it is a practical guide. You can get your copy via my link in the description or pinned comment down below. It's perfect for a rainy day read, or as a conversation starter in your living room. Trust me, it never fails to spark curiosity from guests. Filmmakers love the moments when soldiers fiercely charge a wall, palisades go up in flames, and the air is filled with arrows and bolts. In reality, such assaults were relatively rare. They were scarce for the same reasons filmmakers like them. They are chaotic, deadly, and risky. One reason for this is that the attackers had to expose themselves to the defenders' bolts and arrows, in such a situation when many enemies approached at once. The longbow's higher rate of fire was certainly an advantage, although it remains to be seen how much faster an archer could shoot under these circumstances. Wouldn't that be an experiment for you, Todd and Joe? During a blockade, which made up a good deal of most sieges, archers and crossbowmen had other tasks. Their main objective was to prevent the enemy from freely moving near the fortress by shooting at specific individuals. In a sense, they served as marksmen, trying to eliminate enemy patrols, scouts, or anyone else who dared to leave cover. When this suppressive fire worked, sometimes just a small group of archers could hold a castle. For example, in 1404, 28 English crossbowmen successfully defended Carnarvon Castle against the superior army of the Welsh rebel Owen Glendower. During a blockade, which could last for weeks and even months, it was probably not desirable to shoot a lot of arrows or bolts in a short space of time, as there was usually only a limited number. Archers and crossbowmen would therefore probably have tried to inflict as much damage as possible with as few projectiles as possible. This is why scouts, engineers, and high-ranking individuals were sought-after targets. The most famous example is probably Richard the Lionheart, who was killed by a crossbow bolt during the siege of Chalice Castle in 1199. With this type of shooting, reacting quickly and shooting accurately could be a great advantage. This brings us to the second argument, namely that the crossbow was better suited to accurate reactive shooting because it could be held loaded and was ready whenever a good shot presented itself. A longbow, in contrast, couldn't be held loaded because it takes damage if it's kept on full draw for too long. Instead, it has to be drawn right before shooting. It is important to remember that we're talking about warbows here, some of which had a draw weight well over 100 pounds, and can't simply be drawn like the good old toy at summer camp. To shoot these warbows, archers rely on a specific technique, with a complex sequence of movements that can't be adapted at will. But this argument is not entirely correct either. Certain crossbows can be kept loaded for a while, especially those with steel laths or prots, which is the bow part of the crossbow. But the point is, steel prots only really became widespread in the 15th century. Before then, most crossbows had wooden or composite prots, and wooden prots were usually made from the same wood as longbows, either yew or ash. Hence, it is likely that wooden prots also took damage if they were held loaded for too long. The crossbowmen certainly didn't have to shoot immediately, like the archer did. Still, taking a loaded crossbow on an hour-long patrol was probably not a good idea. Composite prots made of wood, horn, or sinew were more expensive than wooden ones, but they were also stronger. This meant they could probably take the tension a little longer without taking damage. But as far as we know, no tests have been done on this. We don't recommend trying this with your historically accurate reconstructed crossbow, but please comment below if you have any such experiences. Nevertheless, a crossbowman could prepare a crossbow and keep it loaded, even if it was only for a minute or so. This would allow him to react more quickly and reduce the time he needed to expose himself when shooting. In contrast, because of the sequence of movements an archer had to make, he could only prepare in cover to a limited extent before stepping forward to shoot, whereas the crossbowman could remain in cover until fully ready. This brings us to the third argument, that in a siege, the most significant disadvantage of the crossbow was neutralized: its long reload time. One of the biggest drawbacks of the crossbow was that it took longer to load because it usually required a tool, for example a winch or lever. As a result, its maximum rate of fire was much lower than that of the longbow. Todd, for instance, can't shoot 2 bolts with his 860-pound crossbow in the time Joe Gibbs sent 6 arrows flying with his 160-pound longbow. In another test, even a simple hand-spanned crossbow with only 130 pounds lost the race against a 130-pound longbow. It is a matter of debate how relevant the rate of fire was in battle, but the long reload time would have undoubtedly been a problem for crossbowmen because they were vulnerable when they were busy with their winch or lever. This disadvantage would certainly have been reduced if the crossbowman stayed in one place and had solid shelter. A wall or protective screen would have allowed him to reload while under cover and only need to step forward to the embrasures or loopholes to shoot. Also, during sieges, many people, women and youths for example, did not fight but supported the combatants. With their help, a crossbowman could shoot with 2 or 3 crossbows. But even if he was on his own, the option to reload in cover would have been a huge help. As we have seen, the main task of the defenders as archers was to ensure that the enemy could only enter a certain radius of the fortress at the risk of their lives, and thus had to keep a distance. The main task of the attackers as archers was to ensure that the defenders could not carry out this task undisturbed. Therefore, the two sides struggled for fire superiority to achieve freedom of movement. Their goal was not necessarily to shoot as quickly as possible, or hit with every shot, but to force the enemy into cover by keeping up a steady rate of fire. Due to the risk of being hit, the enemy had to exercise caution near the castle and set up their siege camp at a safe distance from the defenders. In this scenario, range mattered much more than precision and penetrating power. For the defenders, this meant the greater the range of their weapons, the further away they could keep the enemy. Crucially, the defenders had the advantage of an elevated position, which increased the range of their archers. Joe, for example, shot 24 meters farther from the 18 meters high Pope's Tower than from the ground, and in an experiment by Professor Anna Crawley, archers shot a full 100 meters farther when they were 12 meters above ground level. Although war crossbows typically have a significantly higher draw weight than longbows, they transfer less potential energy to the bolt. They have a high penetrating power at short range, but a shorter maximum range. For example, in this test, a longbow with 110 pound draw weight had almost a third more range than a crossbow with 130 pound draw weight. So when it came to keeping the opponent at a distance, the longbow tended to have the edge. But this would have been neutralized, at least partially, by the fact that the attackers needed to get quite close to the fortress to reliably hit the defenders. Tests in 4 castles in France have shown that an archer's chance of hitting a loophole at a distance of 40 meters was only 2%, which increased to about 33% from 15 meters. Of course, this is highly dependent on the skills of the archer and the type of loophole. Still, the experiment clearly shows that having a chance of hitting the defender required getting pretty close to a fortress. So back to the big question, was the crossbow superior as a siege weapon? Both weapons had advantages and disadvantages, and were used in battles and sieges. Which one was used would have depended first and foremost on availability. We do not think that one weapon was inherently better suited to sieges, but would love to hear your opinions, arguments, and suggestions.